Autism is a spectrum of disorders characterized by a loss of language, communication, and social skills, and it typically begins in early childhood when the child has not yet reached the age of 3 years. In some children, seizures and mental retardation may also occur. So, what we mean with a spectrum of disorders is illustrated for us here. We can have extreme ability in some areas, for example, often some musical or mathematical ability, and then we can have on the other end severe learning disabilities. So classical or classic autism usually involves mild, moderate to severe learning disability, but a high functioning autism is referred to as Asperger's syndrome, and usually these individuals have an average to above average IQ and even extreme ability in some areas. Autism affects 3 to 6 children out of every 1,000, and what is interesting, it is known that it strikes 4 times as many boys as girls. In some research that has been published, there seems to be a link between autism spectrum disorders and schizophrenia. 10% of cases of autism also has Fragile X syndrome, Down syndrome, and Rett syndrome. I've posted here a link to a YouTube video that you can watch at your own convenience. But what I do want to highlight here in this short little explanation of what is scientifically known about autism is the genetic component that have been elucidated. So far, more than 30 genes have been associated with autism. And these are from many different studies that have been done during the last 15 to 20 years. What is very noticeable is that there, specifically on chromosome number 15, seems to be 15 missing genes, and between all the individuals that they have studied thus far. 2 genes in particular may finally explain how autism develops. We're not quite sure how that develops yet. These genes are called NHE6 and NHE9. And what happens is that these genes seems to be misregulated. In other words, the regulation is not normal. And if these genes are misregulated, it may affect the number of the cell adhesion proteins that is being produced in an individual. Now, these cell adhesion proteins are neurexins and neuroligands. They're very important in synaptic connections in our neurons, and they're associated with our learning and memory. So the autism genetic landscape seems to indicate that 3% may be from Mendelian single gene inheritance patterns, and then 5% chromosomal and maybe some copy number variant anomalies. 5 to 10% de novo, and new or single gene mutations that didn't exist before in a parent that is now seen in the offspring. And then 80 to 85%, that is very high percentage. It's just unknown. We don't know, or it may be multifactorial. So with what we mean here with multifactorial is that there is not only many genes involved, right? But there are other factors as well. Environmental influence, as an example, that can also play a role. And therefore, we've defined that as multifactorial. And so that makes it very complex. It increases the complexity of any disease or disorder. So the fact that there's so many genes involved, of course, just increases the complexity of this disorder. And that's why we see such variation among individuals that have autism. So I want to just go back here to the spectrum and point out something that we've learned before when we talked about that continuum. If we see a trait that is exhibiting a continuum, we know this continuous variation this typical bell-shaped curve with an optimum here in the middle, and then lower to both extremes, shows us that this is a polygenic scenario. So we know that it's not just polygenic in this case, but now you're adding environmental factors and so on, and then that of course becomes a multifactorial trait. So yes, it is polygenic. It does show the continuous variation. It is quantitative in that we can measure or we can determine which genes are involved. But it is also more complex than that. It is in fact multifactorial. So if we get back here, down here, I do want to show some of the nervous function here. We said that those neurexins and neuroligands are types of adhesion proteins. And so these are very important, we said, in the synaptic connection. So let's look at that just down here. There's a nice diagram of a synapse occurring here, and shows a presynaptic and a postsynaptic neuron. Of course, we have many of these in our nervous system. And if these neurexins and neuroligands here are either too few or can be even overproduced in some cases, then of course it's going to influence how these synapses occur here in our nervous system. And that can have a drastic effect on our experiences, our learning, our memory. I want to end off by just pointing out something that is very, very important. And I can't stress this enough. Over the years, I've had many students tell me that autism is linked to vaccinations, and they've even given me some examples of how in their family, say they had a sibling that developed autism after having a vaccination. I do want to point you to these very important links I've shared here from the BBC and also some from ABC News. And these are not new. In fact, some of these are from the 90s, because it has been known for quite some time that the research that Andrew Wakefield published in the Lancet in February of 1998, in fact, has been retracted. This is very important to know. Now, what does it mean if something is retracted? It means that upon further investigation, it was discovered that the research was fraudulent. So what that means is that the investigator or his collaborators with him, they falsely reported either data or misled the reader in thinking that there was in fact a link between autism and vaccination. So what Wakefield tried to show was that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination, that MMR vaccine that you've probably heard of, was the cause of autism. Well, since his research has been retracted, that caused him to actually lose his qualification. Some of his credentials has been stripped and taken away from his name. And in fact, we've had many other studies done after this in the years following, and even some, to this day. And every single study that has been done since that time has found that there's no association of the MMR vaccine and autism. Large cohorts that have been studied, even among children with other risk factors for autism, there's been no link established. And you can certainly go read this article that I posted also here in this journal. Go read it for yourself and go look at what has been done after this one article of Wakefield was published in the Lancet. But as I said, I wanted to point out to you that this is false information, and that we shouldn't propagate fraudulent research that have been published in the past, especially if it has been retracted. So let's continue to hope and support research in the field of autism, so that we may finally understand how these NHE6 and NHE9 genes are regulated and how they're misregulated and all the intricacies of that, and so that we can understand how to help these individuals with autism and perhaps find a really good treatment or even a cure. That should be our focus.